John Davidson. Do I call you John Tron Davidson or John Davidson?
John Tron Davidson's my official title, but John's fine for colloquial purposes.
The master of heavy repping and creator of the Plectoverse.
That's me. Evening, everybody. Nice to be here.
Yes, the Plectoverse. I was perusing your Instagram. You are a creator of guitar picks,
Yes,
plectrums.
I am now.
And,
Yeah,
and I see that you just got back from the London Guitar Show. That's awesome.
yeah. I did the London Guitar Show on Sunday, the international show. That's my second time being up there, and I was joined by Michelle from Mean Tone. Came over from Belgium to give me a hand, which was very good of him.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
And international, how international does it get?
I mean that is how they bill it.
Sure.
But essentially, it's guitar makers from all over the country, and some from overseas. I understand
Okay.
German makers and so on. So there were a lot of vintage people there. So a lot of really really old stuff, shared old masqueraders and
Oh, nice.
the Rickies with the 12-string Rickies with the comb and some other wild stuff that I'd never, like fretless stuff I'd never seen before. But it's a good day. It's on 2 floors in Kempton Park Racecourse.
Wow. Awesome.
So
Is it
yeah,
getting bigger every year?
the guys that are running it, the Horties, have been running it now for well over a decade. And it's got its audience, as is the way with guitar shows. There's things like the Birmingham Guitar Show over here, which is much more industry focused,
Okay.
whereas things like the international, there's a lot of independent makers there. So 81 Guitars was there, PJ Guitars was there, loads of ukulele makers. Hofner had a
Hmm.
stand. Yeah, I saw some pretty cool stuff. It's difficult when you work the shows because you've only got that little sort of window between setting up and the doors opening to actually
Right.
see what's there. The rest,
Sure.
the rest of the time you're just manning your own table.
And I
Um,
apologize, but I didn't add to my preface that you are in the UK. Where exactly in the UK are you?
so I'm in Exeter in the southwest of the UK. Bristol would be the closest big city.
Oh,
But I'm from Glasgow in Scotland originally. I've been living down here since 2006.
wow. And what brought you to the south of England from Glasgow?
So it is a protracted story, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version.
Sure.
Essentially, I was my mother and father are from Scotland, and I was working in car insurance at the time, as well as being an active musician. And I spoke to them and said that I had this tour coming up, a US tour with the band, and for various visa reasons and extraneous things, it kept getting pushed back. But
Hmm.
I had sort of put my notice in to work, and as a result, I found myself without a job. And they said, "Oh, well, we're moving to the southwest." So I said, "Right, well, do you know what? I'm just going to go to the southwest. Fine." And so I moved down here. There in Somerset, which is the next kind of county over,
Nice.
and moved down with them and worked at a newspaper for a little bit. Then I went back to Glasgow, and then I ended up moving back down here and becoming very active in the music scene, working at Project Music here next there, and then I moved to London to work on Denmark Street, and worked in a guitar shop there for 5 years. Uh,
Isn't Denmark is the holy mecca of classic rock in the 60s and
yeah,
70s.
old Tin Pan Alley with the all the songwriting houses and where Sabbath recorded and Hendrix rehearsed and all that
Very
sort of stuff.
cool. Very cool.
Um,
Did you feel like you were just like a kid in Disneyland in that area? Was it like, wow, I've got to go find these clubs and guitar shops, and I bet it was
Well,
awesome.
do you know what's funny is that when you're not from London, and obviously London is a big place.
I love London. It's probably my second favorite city.
You know, it's what's your first favorite city? Dare I ask?
I hate to say it, but I'd have to say New York City.
Fair enough. If you're going to substitute anything, that's a good choice.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. Like I came down there specifically looking for a job, and I walked up and down Denmark Street, handed in my CV, and I to me it was always, especially being I started playing guitar in what, 95, so it's got that thing, of being Denmark Street.
Hmm. And with your CD in hand, you're thinking, I
I
mean,
think,
it's like kids moving to Hollywood to get in movies, and I'm
yeah,
sure you
I mean,
probably thought, how can I not get a job, right?
well, from a guitar shop point of view, I'd obviously worked in guitar shops before. I worked at Biggers in Glasgow, and I worked at Project down here. But that's, and no disrespect to any of those shops, but it's another thing entirely. You're right in the center of it. You're handling so much vintage equipment. We did tons and tons of pedals, tons of bass stuff with a separate bass shop and a separate keys shop eventually.
Wow.
And I played some of the most incredible things. First year 330s, Martins from like pre-war, all sorts of crazy Japanese stuff, which is what I'm really into. Old
So
Yamaha.
you were a salesman?
Yeah.
Okay,
So I did sales down there, and I did social media, and I did historical research.
cool.
So
Oh, wow.
when we got vintage pieces in, I tracked down information about them to put them on the website, wrote all the captions for the website, and then eventually I moved back here and continued to work freelance. But then after a couple of, I went to New Zealand for a bit, for 3 months, and then when I came back here, I worked a couple of jobs, and then ended up working at Manson's guitar shop here, and I was at Manson's for 5 6 years. Worked the Birmingham show with them. I'm still very good friends with all those guys, and because they all live around here, obviously. And I've played in bands with them, and all sorts. And it's weird in the trade, like, the guitar trade in the UK, with all the reps and the companies and so on and so forth. A lot of people have been doing it since time immemorial, and as a result, you end up, you meet reps down the line that you met 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And especially at guitar shows, you're constantly bumping into people like, oh, there's the Korg guy, and there's the guy from Fender, and there's the, because
Uh-huh.
it's not that big it's a big industry, but it's not that big an industry when it comes down to the people.
Sure. Small
Um,
family tree.
yeah,
Yeah. So if you went to Birmingham, you'd be running into Marshall, Vox, the like that. But the London Guitar Show, would you run into these, or is it just like you said, mostly a vintage collector kind of a show?
there was a big. I mean, what's happening in the UK at the moment, and I'm not sure if it's happening in the US, because obviously you guys have still got NAM and all the rest of it, is that over here in the UK there is a sort of developing thing for smaller independent shows. So in Bristol, for example, they've got What's Up Nerds, which is all pedal stuff.
Oh, so you see the guys from the pedal show and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, you get independent mix. So the people at What's Up Nerds this year was Lateral Sound, Chase Bliss, Intensive Care Audio, Audio Storm, ABL,
Mm, mm,
Holy Island, people like that.
mm,
And it's wonderful to see, because it's often easy in the big guitar shows to get kind of lost. And because
mm.
it's much more industry focused, so you've got distros there and what have
Very
you,
good point. Yeah.
um, that it's people setting up meets for, oh, I'm going to buy X amount of string joy, or I'm going to buy X number of gravity, or what have you. Whereas
Mhm.
at the indie stuff, when you buy a lateral pedal, for example, John's a big friend of mine, and I use predominantly his pedals. That when you talk to that person at the stand, that's the guy. There's no
Nice.
additional. guy, you know,
Gotcha.
behind the scenes. It's just the guy that's making the stuff. So the London show is very light on amps because it's very difficult to convey that sort of thing in a guitar show context
Right.
because you got, you
Without
know,
annoying the booths next to you, you know.
well, exactly, because we did no dividers or anything. It's just tables and setups. So you have 10 minutes of quiet followed by 20 minutes of playing, 10, 20,
Sure.
20, and you thought, oh, I really want to hear the upper mids on this, and there's like 10 guys clicking around you at different volumes. Yeah, there's a lot of crazy vintage stuff, a lot of vintage parts. There
Mhm.
was only 2 stands there that were picks, which was myself and Dan from Dan's Guitar Store, who does the Precision series.
Oh, very cool. And you chat with Dan. You guys converse about the industry and how it's changing and the
Yeah, I
boutique,
mean,
plectrum boutique industry, if you will.
well, I mean, he knew me from, we've talked on Instagram a bunch, which is where in the, so I should say that the way the pick scene is split up, generally speaking, is that you've got the vintage collectors,
Ah,
so your Tina Holmes, Brian Bouchard, Guy DeVille's, Jeffrey White, people like that. They are predominantly on Facebook.
huh.
And then the modern scene, although that is changing, there are some groups, boutique bluegrass picks and everything guitar picks is on
Oh,
Facebook as
okay.
well. But the modern scene for your Bog Streets, BHL, Honey, etc., that is all on Instagram. And so they're kind of separate things. So we had talked over Instagram previously, and I've played his picks, and unfortunately he was on the floor below. We were on the first floor, up the stairs, but he made a point of coming up. Because I'm basically had to man. Michelle's there to help me, and he had his own mean tone picks with him, and mean
Ah,
tone is part of the HR shop. But essentially, I was on the stand solo. So as a result, once we got underway, that was kind of it for me. I was
ah,
there to be shut. But Dan very kindly came up and spoke to me, and we had a chat about how to move things forward as a community, because it is very different being when you are something that needs to be experienced in person.
right.
Then you have to coordinate in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
uh, with pedal guys, everybody loves pedals and everybody can see it
Hmm.
for a paint job and all that sort of thing. And
Hmm.
I love pedals. They're a huge part of my playing history and life. But it's easier to convey, at the very least, the dominant characteristics of a pedal over the internet. Whereas to try and do that with picks, so much of it, although there is a big EQ difference in picks, and I'll get into the weeds with that
Yeah.
perfectly.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but in terms of the physical aspect of it, which is the predominant aspect, it's very, very hard to convey that
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
You have to put a thing in a guy's hands. And I said there's a gentleman came in to see me today. So Rom, who was the tech at Manson's, brilliant tech. He's upstairs where I am here in Exeter. We're in a kind of business center building,
Oh, okay.
and he's 2 floors up. So he had a guy in today who's a very long-standing folk player, and I was getting my guitar. I'm going on tour on Sunday, so I was getting my guitar looked at. And he said, "Oh, you're the guy with the picks. Can I come down and see you?" I said, "Yes." And he normally plays, and this is a perfect illustration of this, but he normally plays either a Dunlop 88 nylon or a 1 mil nylon. Right, that's his thing.
Okay.
Uh, Plays predominantly in dadgad and standard tuning, 12 gauge strings, big old acoustic K&K system in it. And he tried some things, and he bought from my personal collection, he bought a Howling Monkey Primate. Shout out to Brian if he's watching. Chap in New York, no less, in Rochester. And then he bought 2 of my own designs. But
Nice.
one of which is one of these, which is this is my Davidson model. This is 6 mil, and it's made of paper stone.
That's
And
insane.
I make these by,
Is that your thickest model?
oh no, God
How,
no.
how thick do you get?
In terms of what I make,
Yeah.
my Goldilocks is between 3 and 6 mil. But the biggest pick I have in the room, bear with me, I'll get it for you, is the Mothership. It's from Plumstone in Australia. It is
Good God.
53 millimeters. That is the biggest. That is the biggest pick currently.
Now, what functionality would that pertain to?
Now, this was so obviously this is ridiculous, right? So we
Yeah.
even as a pit guy, this is absurd. However, the idea behind this was twofold. Firstly, the guy that commissioned it is a lad called Lawrence Chavant, who works at Fender. He's a linguist, and he's left-handed, and he holds his picks like this, right? So like that way.
Okay.
It's granted, very unusual. But the idea was that he issued a challenge to the makers in the scene during lockdown over here, whereby he said 23 mil is the tap out point, right? So 23 millimeters. After that, it's very, very hard to bevel things in a functional way. But he wanted to see who can go the furthest and have it still work. And Plumstone was like, 23, you say? Fine. And he tried to double it, basically. So it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's 7 pieces. It's got Paduk on the outside, and then it's got 2 mahogany sections, and then 3 acrylic sections.
Wow.
I mean, it works. It's weird, not gonna lie, but it's pretty big. I mean, for me personally, I tend to once you hit 9 mil, for me, that's kind of on a personal playing level, that's kind of the limit. But the reason why these things exist and the reason why picks over what we call the 2 mil threshold exists is that if you are going for, let's say we get a wee 0.6 like this, right? So in order to hold this, I have to be here. Yeah. I've got to put all that force in to hold it in place. Whereas if I've got one of my big boys, like my Deacon here, if I hold that, I don't have to put as much force in to hold it.
Very good point. Very good point.
The way to look at this, before we get into the minutiae, the way to look at this is it's a bit like having, if you were a singer, instead of you trying to sing past the volume threshold of the PA, right? If the PA is here and you need to be this loud, you're not going to get this loud because the PA is here, right? If you run the PA louder, you don't have to sing as hard. That's the idea behind the heavy pick thing. So the heavier you go, the more power you've got at lower volumes, the less grip you've got to put in. If you match the material to your skin properly, we've all got different types of skin, then you get a better bond. You don't have to think about it. It really, in my estimation, it should be a lot like if you are playing any style of music and you're using overdrive. Everybody uses overdrive at some point. We spend years, decades choosing the right overdrive pedal. So that when you put your foot down, exactly what you want to happen happens. And that way, it's not something that you are thinking about. It's something you're looking forward to, but it's not something you go, oh, I wonder if that's going to work when I put my foot down. This is the same thing. It should be something that's taken care of, so that when you're playing, all you're thinking about is, oh, I'm, right hand's away, my left hand's doing this. I've got other things to do. I've got my presentation. I've got my moves. I've got, whatever is part of your performance, even if you're just standing there. Using heavier picks, particularly because I predominantly, in the bands that I'm in, I predominantly play baritone. So especially with heavier strings, I really want to be able to make the full use of that range. I want to have the most headroom I can. So if I'm going for a wee winky floppy sort of job, which has its own place, I can talk about that.
Sure.
But for me personally, if I've got a heavy pick or anything that's rigid, basically 3 mil plus, then I know that as I'm going into the string, there's no give, and I can get that amount of power, and then I can go up to this amount of power, but I'm not having to thrash it. Because if you the point of heavy picks is not to destroy everything. So if you play like 5 mil or whatever, the idea is not that you're trying to drill through your guitar to get to the core of the earth. The point is that you don't have to do that.
Right. And I have to back up, John, if you don't mind. You
Sure.
did say in your About Me on your heavyrepping.com, you were struggling as a player with constant fatigue because of your heavy playing. And
Oh yeah.
that's what led you to the research and the development. Can you back up and tell that story?
So I play in 3 bands at the moment.
Okay.
I'm in Leaves, who I'm going out on tour with on Sunday, which is like a post-hardcore thing. I play with Under a Crumbling Moon, which is a great big stately doom sort of band. And I play on my own as House of Quiet, which is ambient textured work. And I go all the way into noise, and then I do very, very soft prepared guitar sort of stuff. But I've played loads of different styles over the years, like country and indie and heavy metal stuff and real angular sort of hardcore stuff and
So
blues.
you're very much like me. You're kind of a chameleon. You play any style that it
I mean,
sounds
if
like you can log into any style at any given moment.
well, I've tried to over the years. I've tried to, whenever I've been asked to do anything, I always operate on the premise that even if I'm not into the music necessarily, like I'm not a big ska fan, for example,
Hmm.
uh, that is by the by. If somebody says, "Do you want to come and play this?" then if it's a style I haven't done, I'm going to learn something. So as long as I go in and I'm very, very, and have always been since day one, I'm very pragmatic about and objective about what I'm doing. So if I'm going to play sideman for somebody, it's not
Hmm.
my door. So I'm there to do a job and I'm there to do it well. So
Hmm.
the point is to listen and do the best I can for the music.
Hmm.
If I'm making my own music, then I'm serving myself entirely. I don't have to think about anybody else because
Hmm.
that should kind of be the point, right?
Hmm.
Uh, but
And the
it's it.
best part is too, being such a diverse player, is
Mm,
that your genres feed off of each other. You take a little
yeah,
bit from here, and it's like suddenly you're taking this genre to a different level. I don't know.
yeah.
I enjoy it. It makes it more fun to be a diverse musician as opposed to locked down into one style.
I think fundamentally, if you are wanting to get the most out of your playing, I mean, you at your core, you're whatever player you are, right?
Hmm.
It's like the Jack Nicholson thing. If you want Jack Nicholson in a movie, that's who you get.
That's right.
Or if you
Yeah.
can't afford them, you get Christian Slater. So that's
Or Nicolas Cage.
or Nicolas Cage. But that they've made a whole career out of doing themselves,
That's right.
right? If you want somebody that's got tons and tons of range, you're looking for somebody else.
Hmm.
But those people are only ever products of who they've studied, what they've been in, who they've listened to, what they've absorbed, and I always remember my role in what I'm doing. So yeah,
So
that's
you're
what.
as multiple genres means you're a multiple athlete, if you will, and you needed to make it a less strenuous task.
Well,
So you started.
the problem I had, if I can find what this is, my bowl of Dunlops.
Yeah. Oh boy,
This
that
is
looks familiar.
this is just Dunlops actually. But back in the day, well, there's one there. Back in the day when I was just starting out, I had the Dunlop .6 Tortex orange, like everybody has the 3.5 inch shape.
Ah, yeah. Mine's a
Yep,
.73. I've been playing this one for decades.
nice.
Point
Yeah,
73. Yeah.
ultra reliable,
I
wonderful
get it. Yeah.
workhorse.
Oh, and the best
Yeah,
part is .73 over time, it starts developing a warp from where my thumb is pushing it in. And
yeah,
it just makes it that it's like working a guitar in. Suddenly
yeah,
that pick is perfect. And I had to rotate it to get it, so that it awesome. It
yeah.
was the go-to. But following you, I'm starting to, well, now I've become more of a jazz player.
Oh
So
yeah.
now I'm starting to use this guy.
Oh, the Ultex. Yeah.
Yes. And but geez, I think I'm going to buy a grab bag of picks from your store. What
So you are.
as a jazz guy, what would you suggest a jazz guy
I mean, if
peruse
you're,
from your catalog?
it depends on. I'll come back to this thing in a moment.
Yeah,
But
I'm sorry, we're jumping
no,
around, which
it's
is
fine.
totally
Like,
common for my episodes.
seeing as you have asked the question, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. If you are a jazz guy, or a gypsy jazz guy, or if you're doing the Berkeley,
Hmm. Hmm.
a lot of those guys, your Pat Metheny's and people like that, tend to favor things like your Jazz XL, because it's a little bit bigger than a Jazz 3. I know a lot of lead guys, your Bonamasses, Eric Johnsons, Petrucci, Andy Johnson. Oh, not Andy Johnson because he's a flow guy, but a lot of those big players, Matt Heafy and that sort of thing, they all favour the Jazz 3 because it's a tremendous thing for lead. It's great for if you're playing with that hand position. If you've got that real like neat down, like you've just got the tiniest amount of tip poking out, and you just want, and you're going from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of your emphasis, a lot of your tonal controls coming from your left hand as
Mm-hmm.
well. Then the Jazz 3 is kind of the way to go. But I mean, the alternative is if you want if you want a good firm sound, if you don't want any give in it, if you just want your sound to come out like a great big brick,
Okay.
then the Altex XL is the way to go. The way it's cut, it's rounded, but it's not beveled in a sloped sense. When you get into thick, because it's 1.24 that model, 1.24 mil. So if you start to taper it in, then you'll see a lot of the people that are in the scene, like Honey, like Dragon, like Mean Tone, or Northern Ghost, or Arcanum, where the tip, instead of it being like this, is it's in this way, that's your cross section. And the reason is that as you slope that in, you've got a greater egress through the string, as there's less resistance, but you've still got control, if you were talking like, if you want to get into the serious no messing about jazz stuff, Kelly Nonis. Kelly Nonis is your guy. He's a lad over here, makes incredible Macaferries, predominantly serves the gypsy jazz scene. His Lolita model is great if you're into the Jazz 3 size. If you're not, if you want something a little larger, then either the Acker or the Turbo. He works mostly in Galalith, which is a great material. Really, really big fan of that. He inserts brass Selmer tailpiece studs into them. Some of the most elegant pick work going. If you want a nice, like, smooth, well balanced tone, then I'd say something like the BHL Hodor in U-Glass is the way to go, or the Arcanum Warlock is really good for that. That was a model that Dan and I designed together. I like a nice wide point of entry, so it's got a really, really wide front on it.
Interesting.
Like the picks I make are predominantly on 90 degrees.
And that's the Davidson that you're holding up right there. Is
That's
that
the
correct?
Davidson. Yep.
Yeah. Can I ask you, when I look at the Davidson, you've been calling it out recently on your Instagram,
Yeah.
and tell me about the geometry of the Davidson. What, there's a hole. That's
Yeah.
obvious. Your flesh will dig into that hole, and you're not going to be
Yeah.
losing it. But when you get notches and you get angles, you get
Mhm.
cut-ins.
Yeah.
What's the math behind that? What's the geometry?
So the idea when I started making picks, the idea was that obviously I have a very large library of plectrums, about 4,500, something like that. Most of which are modern makers. And I knew in my heart of hearts that there was no point in me doing stuff that had been done. I can't do symmetry, for example. I'm hopeless at symmetry. So I knew there was people doing brilliant Jazz 3s, Jazz XLs, 351s, 346s, people doing their own speed bevels, which I'm also not very good at. And so I looked at what was there, and I thought, right, I want to make sure it's got to work. That's the only thing I was interested in. Fundamentally, it's got to work. And then I worked on the basis that I didn't want to waste any material. So I drew a bunch of 35 mil by 35 mil squares. And I said, right, the important thing is it's got to have this bit to work as a pick. After that, it's up to me. What do I want to do? And so instead of, although there are influences from people like Zoofoy and things like that, I've rest his soul. But I was really influenced by a lot of brutalist architecture because that's really what I'm into. And I wanted to pull that into the designs. So a lot of the bits that are chopped off, the slit inserts, the holes, all that sort of stuff, they're all nods to that style of architecture.
Oh, super cool.
And
Yeah.
the reason I named this model the Davidson is because my father, who is retired, he is he is an architect, and funnily enough, he the only style of architecture he doesn't like is brutalism. Um, but it gave me an opportunity to, after years and years and years, because he was actually a jazz clarinet player to begin
Oh,
with.
cool.
Um, and over years and years and years, he never really talked about architecture. And recently, we've been discussing it quite a bit because now I've got this interest that I'm getting more and more. I'm reading more about it, and I've always loved the images of it. But I thought I'm going to learn about this. You know what I mean?
Very
So
cool.
because we were then having that discussion, he suddenly opened up to me about all this architecture stuff, and I was like,
Wow.
well, that's really cool because when he was coming up, he said like I never talked about it because whenever I talked about it, people would go, "Oh, it's so boring. You talk about architecture," and so he didn't discuss it. And I'm physically opposed to anybody shutting out anybody else's interest because they think it's dull. Because to somebody else, that's their lifeblood. That's their
Yeah.
whole thing of like, I'm going to get up in the morning, I'm going to do this, you
Right.
know. And that's the pick scene always has to kind of, and I get this at the guitar shows sometimes, but the pick scene's got to fight for its existence to justify its existence,
Right.
and to say, why wouldn't I just use a dollar pick from the shop? Of course you can.
Yeah.
You can play a guitar worth $100, man. I'm not knocking it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But
Whatever
don't you?
gets the sound out, whatever tool you need to get your sound.
Yeah, but don't you want to get closer
Right.
to this? I mean, they're an extension of the self, right? Any
Right.
expressive medium, any creative medium, paintbrush, guitar, whatever, it's an extension of who we are as individuals, and that is a core tenet of any creative pursuit. So if I can get closer to what I want to achieve by using these specific tools, then
Hmm.
that's the right thing to do. If somebody wants to go down, Aziz Ibrahim, great guitar player, plays for the
Yeah.
Stone Roses,
Yeah.
played Nat really and all that. He is a half mil Dunlop guy,
Well, there you
just
go.
all day long, and he
Yeah.
tears it. And I'm
Yeah.
not knocking that. He's made his choice to go on those
That's right.
tools.
It's like
My
Brian May and his
Yeah,
sixpence,
the
you know.
sixpence,
Yeah.
or Santana and the great big 355,
That's
the
right.
super floppy one.
And I'm a
You know,
huge Santana fan. He's
yeah,
completely influenced my style as a player. And I can, for the life of me, I can't use that pick. I
yeah.
swear to
So
God, it's like using a Japanese fan. It's just
it's a
insanely, yeah.
the 355 is a very large, weird thing,
I
and
don't get it.
there's very few players who that come to mind who favour it. Darren Malakian from System of a Down, Kerry King from Slayer, Santana. Um, there are a few. I mean, the 346, which is its smaller cousin and much more well known, is a huge pick in Japan.
Okay.
Many players are into that over there. But that shape's pretty wild.
It's almost like I should be playing a koto or something.
Yeah,
I don't get it.
yeah.
Maybe that's it. But I now that you mention it, I see the architectural influence. I see an Art Deco kind of
Mm,
a slant in the Davidson,
yeah.
and I would have to say that the 64 mil that you held up would definitely be brutalist architecture.
Oh hell yeah, that's wild. But to return to our discussion from many moons ago, about why I had a problem in the first place. That's a Dunlop 71, right? 500 series, which, by the way, in case anybody's interested, the difference between the Tortex series and the 500 series is that they're both made of the same material. It's just that the 500 series is polished and beveled,
Mm,
whereas the Tortex is straight cut. But the issue that I had was that I have two main problems with my hands. Firstly, is that I've got double jointed thumbs, and also I've got hypermobile wrists. So you can
okay.
hear all that crunching. So basically, what that means is that when I'm playing, sometimes my hand will just lock,
Ah,
and I've got no control. It's like all the feeling goes out from like the wrist up because
ah,
my hand's in the wrong place, right? And also as a youngster, because I didn't know anything about guitar, and you're 16, 17, whatever. I was playing with these skinny wee picks, and I would hold them like this way.
mm,
Better representation. So that's kind of like if you watch like the guitarist from Crypta, Tiana, she's got a grip like that.
Oh, it's almost
Or
like a curl under kind of a
yeah,
thing.
it's like you're playing. It's like the Zach Wild thing, who's kind of playing over. If
Gotcha.
you but the problem with that, when you've got what my thumb's bending that way, is
Ah,
that
right.
when it bends like that, what it does is it pulls the tendon up here, and it was putting so much pressure on this bit of my wrist that it would heat up to the
Jeez.
point where it was like properly hot. And so
Wow.
I went to a physio back in 2001. Oh no, 2003 it was. I went to a physio and he said, "Look, the way this is, if you keep playing like this, you're gonna have to stop,
Jeez.
because you're gonna lose feeling in your hands, basically." And I thought, well, that's not really an option. So what I did was I wore a thumb pick, a Herco flat thumb pick. I wore a thumb pick for 2 years, and that forced my hand into the correct position. Because if you play that way around, you can't play like that with a thumb pick.
And John,
Um,
I have to ask John if you. It's almost like you're so used to driving a stick shift, and suddenly you have to think on automatic. It
yeah,
really changes you as a player. It's almost like re-walking, learning how to walk again.
yeah.
And I'll
It
bet
was.
that was a tough thing to do.
Do you know the funny thing is that if I'd used your normal Dunlop thumb picks like this, or
Okay.
Your Fred Kelly's, which have like just a little dome at the bottom, like the slick picks and all that. If I'd been forced into that, then things would have been very different. The Herco pick is effectively a normal flat pick, just with a guard. So it meant that I could play open-handed if I wanted to. I had to learn how to finger pick for a start, but I could play open-handed. But then I could also go back to doing chord work. And what happened was that I, out of necessity, developed hybrid style, or kind of force learned hybrid style. So all your country guys, all your Johnny Hylands and people like that, and even shredders like Toes and Abassi from Animals as Leaders is big on this, and Steve Vai, all the rest of it, is that you're still picking with your pick, but you're also using your middle and ring finger
Hmm. Mm.
to play the upper strings. Because I could play that way. I started getting into this is about a 2 years of thumb pick, and then I started getting into slightly heavier picks. I was playing Altex XLs. I was playing the Max Grip series from Dunlop, because we had West Side Distribution on Denmark Street, and they
Mm.
do all the Dunlop stuff. So I was just testing everything they had, and then I found out about Gravity and Windspear, and I started trying those out, and they were going up to 2 mil, and that was the first time I'd ever played anything over 2 mil, and I was like, hey, this is very different. This is a different thing. I don't need to play anywhere near as hard, and it worked really well with the hybrid thing. Um, so
Mm.
I started to investigate it, and it was when I started getting into it when I was working in London. I was playing chicken picks, I was playing V picks, I was playing Gravity, and then I went to New Zealand for 3 months after I left London, and I had never used Instagram before, and I started getting into Instagram, and I started to find these makers. I found Windspear, I found CJ Windspear, I found Brockett BHL, um, and I started getting talking to them, and discovered that it's just a guy at the other end.
Right.
Um, and so I was saying, look, I've got X problem, and I'm looking for Y. What do you reckon? And then I got some Dragon's Harps from Corey Whitney in the US. He's using polyamidamide. which is a different thing altogether. But because of that, I looked around and I saw all these makers. Nobody's talking about it.
Huh.
And couldn't find forum posts on it really. I couldn't find any sites dedicated to it, and I was really
Mm.
surprised because my own experience had been so revolutionary in terms of how not just my playing improving, but in terms of how I viewed my interaction with the instrument. That I thought, well, there's got to be more people, and so I would go through. I used to go on Etsy and go through every single page marked with plectrum, every single page marked with guitar pick. Same on eBay, just trying to find people who made picks. This is
Wow.
pre-revamp.
Wow. Yeah.
So I would just scroll and scroll and scroll, and then I would start to find people. I started to find Timbertones, Ace Performance, um, and then when heavy repping kind of got going, and I was doing more reviews and I was interviewing people, then other people started to go, well, this is an interesting thing. And Dan from Arcanum, who I was playing in a band with at the time, he was playing Half Mill Dunlop, and he came round. I was saying to him, look, it's proper floppy, that sounds right on bass. It's just like, you know. And I said, look, come round and try some of the stuff I got. Just, I'm not selling you. This is way before we had the shop. And I said, come round and just have a look and try some things out and see how it changes your experience. So he comes round, he tries out a bunch of picks, and he's like, this is, you know, head,
Mind
top of the
blowing.
head, clean
Yeah.
off. And
Yeah.
so he starts, fast forward a year, he starts making picks. He starts making with interlace acrolester. He starts using Tagua. He starts doing resin overpours. Starts doing stuff from UHMWPE, from aluminium, and then becomes one of the founding members of the heavy repping shop.
Nice.
And we designed picks together. His work is absolutely phenomenal. Really, really nice guy. Northern Ghost hadn't started making picks until the shop started. It was literally
Wow.
that he debuted. James is an amazing maker, a very young guy, really, really good stuff. And he debuted his designs the day we launched the shop.
Wow.
That had never been a thing before. And so if Heavy Repping's legacy is only that it got other people to make picks, I'm totally cool with it.
Nice.
I mean,
And the Plectroverse is currently how many strong? I see at least 20 or 30 different names in the Plectroverse
yeah,
on your website right now.
I think we've got so I handle 10 people myself,
Okay.
including my own picks, and then there are another, I think, 30-ish makers on the site. There are actually more people coming as well because we're redesigning the back end.
Nice.
And it's worth saying that Heavy Repping as a company, if you like, is basically me I do all the photography, video editing, all the chat, all the socials, all the posting, all the sales, all that sort of stuff. And Mika built the website, and that's it. There's not there's not like
Nice.
30 people doing it. It's great and terrible at the same time because she lives in sort of between Spain and Scotland as a coder, and
Okay.
and I work a day job as well.
Ah,
Uh, so it's a very, very difficult thing to run like you would like to run something. And obviously,
sure.
if you are a guitar maker or a pedal maker, you're doing all that social work, and then as a result, you're getting sales with X amount of margin. I have to do the same amount of work for picks, but when I sell a pick at a tenner, then I'm making £3,
Yeah.
not £300.
Yeah. The
And so
profit margin is small,
yeah,
I'm sure.
it's small profit margin, but the workload is the same.
You're not only an entrepreneur, but you are a representative, a guru of ergonomics through picks. It's very, uh, as guitar players, we don't, when you dive in, 90% or more guitar players don't think about the ergonomics of their playing.
No,
Like you said, it's when you dive in as a kid or whenever you pick up your guitar, and that's almost kind of the methodology, a lot having to rethink like you did is super rare because a
Mm.
lot of guitar players are pretty much stuck with the way they learned. Like when I started playing, my guitar teacher in high school hated that my thumb was hanging over the neck. Don't put
Yeah.
your thumb on top. And I'm like, dude, I don't know how many famous guitar players I've. Jimi
Hmm.
Hendrix. I'm a huge Hendrix fan. This is always, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
the ergonomics have to be preached to you, and changing is quite nearly impossible.
Changing's
Uh,
very hard, and
and then you
guitar
hear about
players,
guys like Eric Clapton who are getting to the
yeah,
point where he almost can't play anymore anyway,
yeah.
because of various, but one of them would be his playing style over the decades.
Hmm.
It's just, it takes its toll.
Of
So you're
course.
actually giving you're in a sense, you're giving longevity to players.
I mean, it's a very one of the hardest things that I've found is, especially in the guitar scene, and I'm not ragging on the guitar scene or nothing because I've given 30 years of my life to it, but it is a scene that is a community, I should say, that is entrenched in a violent degree of orthodoxy.
Yes.
It's still, no matter how you cut it, it's at its core, it's still tube screamers and strats.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a Marshall, it must be great. Oh, it's a 70s
Hmm.
Fender, it must be great. The nature of guitar is not that. It's
Right.
wooden wire. It's the old adage about the music game that it's 80% hard work and 70% luck. Um, that sometimes you get guitar. I mean, I played dozens of 70 strats that are turkeys.
Yeah.
I played custom shop Gibsons that are turkeys. I played
Right.
dirt cheap stuff that would blow your mind at your arse. Like there's no, you have to put your hands on things. You
Hmm.
cannot. It's a physical, tactile environment. It's very different landscape now because there's so much plug-in work, which I think is a phenomenal thing in and of itself. All the Kemper stuff and fractals and Axe effects and all that sort of thing. The digital thing was always going to come for the
Right.
practicality side.
Right.
But what I've found over the years working frontline in shops, talking to dozens of players from all walks of life, age brackets, and experience levels, and all that, is that there's very little in the way of doing more research. Like you can look at lots and lots of players, right? So if you're a blues guy, you might be checking out Eric Gales, Bonamassa, Robert Johnson, if you want to go back, you know, Blaine Lemon Jefferson and people like that, and saying, right, blues, 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 great, and excited about that. But why is it? Is the question that a lot of people don't ask. The number of people that used to come into all the shops I worked in, and I'd say, so what strings you need? No idea. I just use whatever. You don't. It's a tension thing. It's if you go from 10s to 11s, it's a huge shift. If you go from 12s to 11s, it's a huge shift. It's
Hmm.
not a case of that. And it rather than it being like, I know guitar shops have a terrible, especially Denmark Street, not gonna lie. They've got that terrible reputation of being like, well, actually, sir, and it's all that sort of thing. Um, Now there's a reason for that. There's a reason people have those reputations, right?
Right.
But the simple fact of the matter is that if you there's a big gap between being a guitarist and learning about guitar. So a lot of people like myself, I didn't have lessons outside of school. Everything else I've learned myself because I was interested in learning it. I could be much better player than I am if I'd sat down like my old mate Ian and book learned and gone, and learn
Hmm.
my scales and learn my
Hmm.
theory. And without that, I still play in open tunings because I like them. I play in most of the stuff I do. I play in Dadgad. In my band Leaves I'm in, I play a baritone in A Dadgad. So AEADEA, because I like drone stuff. I like open chords. I like octave work, and I learned those things because I had an interest. If I had put more effort into the book side of things, and like I can't read charts, I can't read music anymore. I used to
Hmm.
sight read when I was in I used to sight read when I was in choirs and when I played the violin, but I've never been able to do it for guitar. Chord boxes is fine, you know. But the big difference is that a lot of people, um, they just take the information that they want to hear and they get on with it, because guitar is one of the few instruments where, admittedly, unless you're doing classical work or jazz standards, or like repertoire work, it's one
Sure.
of the few instruments where you're at a core level, your degree of skill does not determine either your success or enjoyment.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
you don't have to be good. If you look at and you know what is good and all the rest of it. If you look at a Neil Young, for example,
Right.
so many people picked up the guitar because of that guy. So
Right.
many people picked up the guitar because of Dylan. Can Jeff Beck
Kurt
smoke?
Kurt Kurt Cobain.
Kurt
Yeah.
Cobain,
Yeah.
like all these guys, did they need to? Yeah, and so what's the old Cobain line? I can't play like Segovia, but Segovia can't play like me. Like there's
Exactly.
no, it doesn't have to be one way or the other. It's
Right.
it's like saying it's like having a race for art or something, you know. But a lot of players don't take an interest beyond. Um, I want to play X. I'm really into Guns N' Roses. I'm really into Slash. I want a Les Paul into a Marshall. I found my thing, and I'm going to plow that field for all eternity. That's that's the nature of it. Whatever strings he uses, I want them. Whatever picks he uses, I want them. Whatever cables, blah blah blah. People don't take any interest in cables by and large. They don't take any interest in speakers
Hmm.
or any of that
Hmm.
stuff. But there's a
Hmm.
whole industry built up around saying this is going to do more for you. This is going to do X. We've
Right.
spent years developing Y. You know, there's a
Right.
reason why people use the things they use.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's a tough climb for you because
yeah.
you're right. Your guitar is such an approachable instrument
Mhm.
for every, for the beginner, if you will, the normal Joe off the street. And they could go decades before they start deciding, wow, what pick should I start gravitating towards a
Mhm.
better chord, a better amplifier, and
Yeah.
so you're hitting. So how do you think you could bridge the gap of generations and get to those early stages? How and we're jumping ahead because I wanted to find out how you got into here's my first design,
Yeah.
etc. But the philosophical question is how can you get them at the early stage? How can you make it attractive for them to think of the ergonomics of being a player? Is it necessary? Do you think?
I
Is it
think
a
that
is it a natural selection? Look, if you're going to pick a crappy way of playing, you're going to die on the vine, and good luck for your 10 years because after that you're going to get arthritis or carpal tunnel,
yeah.
or how can you reach the? You know what I mean? Is that a tough thing that you think about, or is it like they'll come to me? I don't need to go
I
to
mean,
them.
it's a very different. If I even compare what learning guitar in the 90s was like to what it's like learning it now,
Yeah,
it's a completely different thing, right? So
right.
back then we had the grunge thing, we had you're just coming out of hair metal, Van Halen's still the boy. You've got your Pearl Jam, Stone Gossard, Mike McCready, people were looking up to them. Then you go into you got the new metal era, which is all riffs, riffs, riffs. And bubbling behind that, you've got the black metal scene, you've got the death metal scene, you've got country, you've got all this stuff happening, right?
Yeah.
The thing that's different now about what people learn, and I see this in young players that I've seen in the shop, or young players that I've seen online and what have you, is that their idols and the way they go about making music is completely different. So if your first exposure to my first exposure to heavy music was like Stiltskins Inside, then the Manic Street Preachers, then Maiden, you know, and
It,
then
that those guys led
yeah,
you to Maiden. Wow. Okay.
yeah, um, because I didn't really know anyone who was into music at school particularly. When I was at school in Glasgow, especially in secondary, everyone was into like Nosebleed Gabba, like proper, just it was just that. The funny thing is that and obviously we're talking pre-internet, right?
Mm.
So when I started getting into music, I would just listen to whatever I could get my hands on. So it was the Beatles, it was Buddy Holly that my parents were into, like Herman's Hermits. like Billy Fury, that sort of thing, and choral stuff because I was doing choir stuff. But then when I started buying records on my own, it was like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Pink Floyd's The Division Bell, that sort of thing. And a lot of those choices were forced upon me because I'd go in to buy records and they didn't have the one I wanted. And I was like, well, this is a Pink Floyd record. It's not Dark Side of the Moon, but I'll give it a rattle. And so you end up getting shaped by these things and something just catches your ear. And I don't think it's necessarily, I think when you're somebody who's, whether consciously or not, if you're open to things, then you will be taken on a path because you're looking for similar feelings rather than styles of music. So, I'm not big into hardcore, but my favorite band of all time is a hardcore band. And, that sort of stuff. And I think a lot of the time now, what kids are exposed to as Instagram guitarists is that you get a guy with a bunch of neon tubes in his room shredding the arse out of something, or you get people doing very close harmony work, doing real sort of country, and indie singer-songwriter stuff. And so it's easier to get better equipment for less money. All the home recording thing is the idea of doing what we're doing now and just having a chat through a Focusrite Scarlett, sitting in whatever with a couple of mics was like the Babylon back in the 90s. This was I didn't even know people with 4 tracks. Like we used to record demos onto mini disc in the practice room because it had a mic built into the wall, and that's that was your rehearsal tapes. You know what I mean? And that was in a posh place. The other places had, you go in and you'd have a JC 120 over there that kind of worked, and you'd have a 900 with no knobs on, and that was the practice pad in Mary Hill, which if it's still there, props.
Well, John, you brought up a good point. Is back in the day, it was get your issue of Guitar Player magazine and peruse it like it was the Holy Bible, and learn the tablature and try and figure out how do I make this tablature sound like the fucking song I'm listening to, right? And look at the pictures of the guys playing. Oh, that's what a Kramer looks like. Holy shit, a Charvel. But nowadays, I think you're right. I think social media is exposing the new generation to various picking techniques like that. That one kid that was on Rick Beato recently, that he has a flamenco style, but he's playing metal sweeping, with his flamenco fingers and paying attention to the littler things that back in the day went unnoticed. You didn't think about what pick is James Hetfield using. But now we have that opportunity to go back on that video, rewind, and go, son of a bitch, I think he's using a da-da-da through a da-da. And you're right, the internet makes that stuff more accessible.
That boy that you're talking about, the flamenco cat who's playing in the Yamaha Rev Stars, can't remember his name, but that guy's ridiculous.
Oh, beautiful.
Like, absolutely absurd.
Just smooth. And now you have to look him up because Rick Beato has him and another guy on a new video about a month old. And the other guy is a pick player. And he says, Rick asks, can you play with the pick? And the guy hands him his pick. And the kid, he can play, but it's just not the same.
Yeah.
He turns into a completely different player.
If you're gonna do that style, that's what you're doing. Like that's devotion to the cause, And I think one of the big differences is with your people like Beato and all that sort of stuff is that what's very different now is that because of the sheer volume of information that people have, that I think the kids are, to use the phrase, the kids, they're just a lot more open to stuff because they don't come with all the baggage that we come with.
That's a very good point.
Like particularly the generation before me, which is very dyed in the wool in terms of guitar, because that was what was there. It was Jap Ibanez's, it was Fender, it was Gibson, it was, that'd be pre-PRS. Do you know what I mean? So like they had, they might be more into the Dan Armstrong Ampeg plexiglass, or the Hop Saturn, or any of these older brands. because that's what they grew up with. It's the same thing with like, I've owned a lot of weird stuff over the years, guitar wise, because I always tried to buy stuff I was interested in.
Mm.
Um, and I've only owned one Les Paul. I had an Epiphone Custom back in like 2000, and I've had two Strats. And then outside of that, it's all been weird crap, like in a Mockingbird for a while, and
I have to
Jet,
add, a Mockingbird. You were one of the few guys that
yeah,
owned a Mockingbird.
Mockingbird,
I have to
yeah,
ask, what's the guitar? You've got this wild, beautiful wood tone
yeah,
guitar that you're playing on your Instagram. What brand is that?
yeah. So I work with. I'm not 100% sure he's still. I think he's taking a little break from making at the moment. I have four Odessas. They're made in Bath, just up the road from me. I have a baritone that I play in Leaves and Crumbling Moon. The stick is the one that you're talking about. That was the first one I got from
Ah,
him.
yeah, it's
That's good.
gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a great guitar. That I've
What
got
are you playing that stick through? What amplifier?
my
Well, on your what's your amp of choice, I guess? Because on
well,
Instagram, it looks like you're playing it through a couple different setups, probably.
I play it through loads of crap. So my gigging amp is I have two Sonus amps which were built in Scotland. Tiny brand that no one's ever heard of. Company
Mm,
was really badly run. The amps are incredibly unreliable,
mm,
but you honestly use them to restart a dead planet. Like they run on KT88s. They're the loudest clean sounds you'll ever hear in your life. Tam who built them, Tam Lynch's name was. He was absolutely pathological about avoiding distortion. So those will go to 65 watts clean,
wow.
which is, as you know, totally unnecessary. But I've got two of them. I've got a one by 15 and a 2 by 12, but they're too heavy to use
Mm,
because they've each one's got two transformers in it,
yeah.
a US and a UK transformer, and
Oh God.
one of them caught fire. Um, but it's been repaired. It's fine. But the one I'm
Okay,
taking
good.
out, the one I take out on the road is I have a Fender Blues Deluxe that I got for 200 quid because it was in a flood.
Oh,
Um, and I've discovered over the years that as long as, and this isn't guitar shop guy talking, this is just experience talking, that as long as it's loud enough, I can work with it. The difficulty is that when you're tuned down that far, and because it is a baritone and not, I do have a 7 string as well as a backup, but because it's a baritone in baritone scale, so it's a 28.5 scale, um, with 14s, that in that tuning with that register, that as a 1 by 12 that amp shouldn't cope with it, but it does.
wow.
Um, but on Instagram, I play mostly through. I collect weird vintage amps, but solid state stuff. So I've got a prototype Sims Watts 2 by 12 from the 60s.
Wow.
I've got a Hofner Stereo 50, which is two amps split into separate amps. It's a weird thing. I've got
Is this gear that you acquired while you were at the music store?
no,
Were you one of those guys like, look what just came through the door, and that's leaving with me?
no. The only thing I did that with was I did that with pedals a lot because it's easy to do
Ah,
with pedals.
sure.
But I did it with I try not to keep anything I'm not using
Uh-huh.
because I've always worked in guitar shops. I've never had any money. So I tended to I bought an American Strat on hired purchase back in 1997. It was a 1997 Big Apple Strat in shoreline gold with two humbuckers and no trim. So it was
Oh,
incredibly hard to get
wow.
incredibly hard to get rid of. And
Huh.
I got it for peanuts because nobody wanted a Strat without a trem and single coils, right? But I didn't know that. So I was
Mm,
just like, I really like this. Let's go. And so that was, I chopped that in for something and I chopped that in for something else. And I just kept
wow.
chopping and chopping and chopping until eventually I got the stuff I've got now, which is the four Odessas. I've got a Yamaha SGV that I bought in Japan, which is a great guitar. Really, really fun. I've always thought they were super cool. I've got a Turkish long neck saz, which is this thing.
Ah, fantastic. Wow.
I've got, yeah.
And
Um,
what pick do you use on that?
I use traditional saz picks. They're kind of about yay long, and they're really, really floppy nylon. There's tons of trim picking in it.
You have a video on YouTube where you're talking about the history of the plectrum. I
Yeah,
think it's from like 5 years ago, and I think you
yeah,
mentioned that pick. Yeah.
yeah. It's that whole thing is I've got to give major credit to Joe Macy, who is no longer with us. And Joe knows Joe knew more about picks than I'll ever know. He was the guy. He was the guy that the guys went to find out about stuff.
Wow.
And I think his collection after he passed away was divided between Brian Bouchard, who wrote guitar picks of Rock and Roll 1 and 2, and Guy DeVilles, who are both preeminent collectors. I got some crazy stuff from Joe, insane vintage stuff. I did an audiobook of Will Hoover's Picks, The Story of Celluloid, which was approved by Will
Wow.
through, because he doesn't have any social media, but Guy DeVilles is a big mate of his. Will lives in Hawaii, and he gave it his blessing, and I was extremely honoured to do that. And I also did Joe's sort of novella that he wrote called An Introduction to Vintage Guitar Picks, parts 1 through 9.
Wow.
And that was my very first that was my first journey into doing audiobook stuff, which I
Cool.
really enjoy. And that was a huge learning experience for me because like I'm a modern collector, right?
Right.
So I didn't know that much about. I mean, I loved seeing the pictures and stuff. I didn't know that much about the vintage scene, and so while I was doing that, that huge document, I learned loads, and I still go back to Joe's channel all the time, and I've got a playlist on youtube.com/heavy repping. If you go to the heavy repping channel, there is a playlist just called Joe Macy's YouTube. If you want to learn about the French Duras, if you want to learn about the D'Andrea Adlib series, or cork grips, or Korean mandolin picks, or any of these things, he
Wow.
was the guy. He was the guy.
Good to know.
And yeah, I learned a crazy amount from him. He sent
I
me
have to.
the oldest pick I've got, which is a 1904 ABT Valentine.
You hold that pick. You talk about that pick on that video, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're like, "This is the holy grail. This is da da da." It's
This is
like,
what
wow.
it's definitely one of the oldest. The oldest one is the Fernando de Cristofaro mandolin pick from 1881.
That's amazing.
It's the oldest known plectrum found.
And where is that? Where is it?
Well, that was in Joe's collection. I don't know where it is now. I would imagine Guy or Brian's got it, but he was a Fernando de Cristofaro was a mandolin teacher in Milan, and that was he published a book on how to play the mandolin, and he
Huh?
was the first person
Huh?
to ever have his name on a plectrum,
Huh? What do you know?
as it
Interesting.
happens.
So the Davidson is your newest style, John, and
Yes,
or is that is your newest?
yeah,
What and it comes in different millimeter thickness.
yeah. Mostly, I work in either 3 or 6,
Okay.
because that's what I like. I
Well,
can make things thinner, you know.
by request.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I tend not to. What? Well, the reason I'm slightly cavalier about that is because, as is the case, when I started making picks, all the boys in the guild, we've got a guild chat on Instagram,
Yeah.
for everyone in the shop, and I said to everybody, I'm starting to make picks, and everybody went, for Christ's sake, don't do custom work. Don't do it, because what they'll say is, I know you make all of this.
Uh-huh.
Can you make me this thing over here that's got nothing to do
Uh-huh.
with it? And also, I
Okay.
want a bunch of changes as you're going along. And I was like, okay.
Uh,
So I make the styles that I make, thick
uh-huh.
or thin, in
Okay.
materials that I like, and that's what I do.
What are how many styles do you have right now in the library?
So initially it started off with it was the Deacon, the Pebble, and the Warden. And then I got tired of making the Pebble because it's basically one massive curve, and it was just a huge arsehole. So I've got a bunch of those left. It's a great pick. It's my version of the Jazz 3. But even though it looks nothing like it, but that was my concession to tradition, if you like. The Warden was like my home plate. But the Deacon was, which is this one here, that was my first design. And it's an offset, and it came from a bunch of drawings that I did when I was on a weekend away with my good lady, and I sat down at the table and I'd drawn a bunch of stuff because she's a proper artist. And I sat and said, "What do you think of that? What do you think of that? What do you think of that?" And she was like, "Well, that's pretty cool." And so I thought, right, I'm going to try and do that. So I made this. Um,
Was the Deacon the necessity is the mother of invention, the pick you were designing for your playing at
yeah,
first? Okay.
yeah. I wanted.
Is that the pick that you use today, or have you moved on to one of your other styles? Is the Deacon still your
Um,
kind of your go-to?
I mean, recently my, as is the way with these things, my favorite one is whatever the most recent thing is I've designed.
Sure.
Because I try and refine as I'm going along. But the one that's stayed around since day dot has been the Deacon.
What
Um,
about the Deacon did you like, and it worked for what you were looking for?
well, the key things for me were, like I said, as long as we've got the striking bit,
Hmm.
then it's up to you. What I wanted was something that sat inside the hand, that guided you,
There's
but
that
didn't.
arch for your thumb. I can see
Yeah,
your thumb fitting right into that curve.
it guided you, but it didn't force you into holding things a certain way. I'm not into that. So you can use whatever corner you want. It's, once you bought the thing, it's your call. But the idea was basically that I wanted as much surface contact with the fingers and thumb as I could possibly muster, without it feeling clumsy, and without it being something you were thinking about. So
Makes
I
sense.
just I tried a bunch of things. I said, oh, that tip there, that's not really working. So I'm going to shave that off a bit more because I'm aware of it in my hand. Or like if I just cut this at 45, then when I'm going into the string, I feel like I'm going over a speed bump. So that's got to change. So I've got to curve that. Um, and then yeah, it was trying things out. I've tried so many things and so many guitars over the years, because that's what you do in the trade, that if something's not working, you can tell in two chords if it's not working.
Right.
Um, Playing it's the old thing, especially when you're trying guitars out. If you play two chords on a guitar and you're not that into it,
Right.
playing it for an hour will not change that.
It's not going to change it. So, John, when you developed the Deacon,
Yeah.
the shape and the thickness that you wanted,
Mhm.
what was the first material you went to? And you're like, you know what? I need to
Okay.
start making this for me. And
Okay.
now it's like, I need to start making this for other players.
So this is slightly ridiculous, right? So the very first pick I made, um, with by hand, was I went round to Dan from Arcanum's place, because he's way, well versed. He makes body casts for the NHS, so he's used to making, like, really complicated geometry and to fit people's legs and all that sort of stuff.
Wow.
And he's a very old friend of mine, and so I went around to his place and he taught me through the process. This is how you use a bandsaw. This is how you use a belt sander. I'd never owned tools before this, and I was just like, I just want to do it. Do you know what I mean? So I got some files, and I got a shitty clamp, like the worst clamp you've got, like a suction cup one that goes on the table, like proper litter, right? And I was like, right, I'm gonna give this a proper go. And I made one of his cleric models, which is the first model he made, using a material called plasticier, because I got it as a sample. It was free. I had no money invested in it, and I was just like, whatever. So cool. The first material that I made a pick out of on my own without people's assistance was, I made a tiny Jazz 3 style home plate from mammoth ivory, because it was the only material that I had
How the hell did you acquire Mammoth Ivory?
Oh, a guy. Oh, so a guy came
And
into
you don't have to
Manson's.
give
Used to.
any black market
Oh no, it's
context.
nothing. It's nothing like that. But this guy came into Manson's, and he used to make like he made like canes and fancy belts and stuff. And Mammoth Ivory had, just because of climate changes and stuff in Siberia, a lot of mammoth tusk and mammoth molar and mammoth ivory was just poking out of the surface.
Oh
So
wow,
people were harvesting it and just flogging it in town for buttons.
wow,
Um, so he had a couple of strips of this stuff, and I bought it off him for a tenner. And then I tried to make. I got one of my colleagues, Simon, from the Manson Custom Shop. I got him to make a rough pick for me out of it to see if it would work, because I played bone and stuff before, but I'd never worked it. The smell is very similar to bone. If you're, when you're doing guitar workshop stuff and you're cutting nuts,
yeah,
whatever, it kind of smells like
yeah,
that. But yeah, I went right in at the deep end with Mammoth Ivory because I figured this shit's pretty tough, right? If I can work that, then when I come to do acrylic and Keranite, that'll be a piece of piss, right? So that was my thinking, and there wasn't enough there that I was going to start banging out a bunch of these, because pricing that sort of stuff was really hard, and I knew I was going to make tons of mistakes, right? So I started off with Mammoth Ivory, and then my good friend Steve at Raven, who's funnily enough, lives right next to Kempton Park Racecourse, and very gracefully came and saw me the other day, which was really cool. He sent me a bunch of corian, which is used in nuts and saddles and all that sort of thing. And that was tougher than acrylic, and looked cooler because it kind of looks like stone. And
yeah.
so he sent me a huge box of offcuts, and I just kind of cut my teeth on
Nice.
that.
There you
Uh,
go.
and then I wanted something that was hard and classy, because I've tried to make my designs relatively classy, right?
Sure, absolutely.
So
You can tell. You can tell.
so I wanted something that would adhere to that, but also that I knew that I believed in as a material, because if I'm not standing behind it, it's a waste of time, right?
Mm,
So I contacted Surface Matter in London, who are a stockist of Richlight, and I got a couple of sheets of Heritage Richlight, which is the black stuff, and I started working on that. I had played picks made from Richlight before. I got talking to Chris Aldrich at Dragon, about it. He's a big Richlight fan, and he said, "Oh, you got to try this stuff, man. You got to try it." So I got a hold of some of that. I really enjoyed working with that. It's incredibly satisfying when you get it right. And so it started coming in a bunch of different colors. I got all of that stuff, and since then, um, yeah, before I got into the pick making thing, I'd always loved Kaysen, Galilith, Tagua, Bone, Richlight, things like that. And so I decided I want to work with those materials. So I worked a lot with Kaysen, as evidenced by, this is my Ionic model,
nice.
which probably looks a bit weird on camera, but fine.
Yeah. So
Um,
if someone navigates to your site to buy
yeah,
some picks, can they choose the material, Corian, Rich Light, and then the shape or is it the Deacon comes in this only, the Davidson comes in this material? How would they go about decide
um,
like, dude, I'd really like the Davidson, but it's not in Corian. Can I have that in Corian, or
I mean,
is
they can
that kind of
always
what you're trying to avoid?
that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to avoid is people saying, "I really
Hmm.
like what you're doing, but can you make me something else?"
Hmm.
Because if you want something else, we have 40 other people on the site. Go and get it from them.
That's right.
Because especially if you want a traditional 351, then there are people out there who will do a way better job of it than I will. If you want the
Hmm.
stuff that I'm making, buy that.
And you just said a 351. You explained on your YouTube video with a really great laid out chart that the 351 was a press,
Yeah,
the standard number that was on the original, was it Dunlop
yeah.
with the original
Well,
stamp? Sorry?
the original hammer die,
Yeah.
that was used to cut the picks,
Yeah.
and the numbers of those hammer die was what gave the pick shapes their designations.
Mm.
That was Luigi D'Andrea back in the day.
And 351 is basically the traditional shape
Yeah.
that we're talking about. This
When
would
you
be a
think
351 shape.
Yeah, when you think about a guitar pick, that's what that is in
Gotcha.
essence. There
Gotcha.
are lots and lots and lots of variants of that. And if you go on to Joe's channel, in fact, if you go into that history of guitar picks video that I did, or that I read out for Joe, I should say, I'm not taking credit for that. That there is a breakdown of all of the shapes. There's a shape chart.
Nice.
So if you type in guitar pick shapes into Google, you'll get pointy, jazz, shark fin. That's not what they're called, right?
Right.
The shark fin is a shark fin. That was the Landstrom shark fin, which was developed in Sweden. But that's its own thing, and that's now made by Dunlop and a bunch of other people like
Gotcha.
Alice and Tiger and all that.
I mean,
But yeah,
when it comes to designs, John, what is what's the next in line now that you've released the Davidson? Beautiful pick. I might just buy one just to have one. Uh, what's mulling through your mind now on the next design? Where do you want to take it now?
so the ones that I'm making at the moment are the Ionic, the Doric, the Corinthian, the Davidson, the Deacon, Euclid, and the Tuscan. And the Tuscan is the new one, but the Tuscan is really hard to make, and I
Why
don't
is that?
know. Well, I got one handy. Yeah,
And these
it's
are what you're about. The Tuscan, if you showed one now, you cannot purchase that yet. It's in development.
Technically at the moment, because I'm going to go on tour for a week, you can't purchase any of my stuff until the 14th.
And you did mention that on your Instagram.
I don't know when this video is going up, but yeah, the Tuscan's going to be done in very small numbers. It is very complicated to make, but the reason that I did it is because I did a bunch of prototype, almost art pieces, that I just wanted to see, will this work? And with the Tuscan, I made one out of solid wool. It's made by a company here in Devon.
And that's harvested from sheep's wool.
Yeah.
Oh man, fantastic!
It actually is sheep's wool.
That's fantastic.
So what they do with it is that they take coarse sheep's wool, Welsh mountain sheep's wool, and they lay it out flat, and then they've got rich like pulp that goes through it, and then more wool, then rich like pulp, then more wool. Because rich light is traditionally rich light is a 65-35 split of recycled cardboard and phenolic resin, unless it's R50, which is a 50-50 split, but that's a separate thing. The way that they do it with solid wool is they take the wool and they take just the pulp bit of rich light, so not the resin, and they bond those two things together, and then it gets massively compressed, and then it gets dried out, and it's used for high-end furniture. And the way I found out about it was that a chap in Bath called Uberfrank Guitars made an entire guitar out of it, scratch plate, body, neck, like the whole 9 yards. And I looked at it, I was like, what the fuck is that? I've got to get my hands on this. And then so it turned out that the company was also based in the place. Well, the company's based in Bath, but they've got a tiny little factory, and it's in Kilmington, which is about 40 minutes from here. And I contacted them and I bought some samples and tried making some picks out of it, and I was like, love this. It's very close in tone to Rich Light, but it's slightly darker. It's got the same bass response, but slightly darker. The upper mids are a bit more firm. Rich Light's got a little bit more top end to it, but they're both incredibly durable, which is something I look for. I like natural materials that are durable. Like Tagua, I'm a big fan of that, but working with Tagua is a massive dick, and honestly, because every nut's got a void in it, and you've got to slice it and stuff, and it's really hard to do on a bandsaw. So yeah, I'm the protracted nature of this is I made a pick, I made a test pick before the Tuscan was a model out of solid wool, and I just liked the feel of it. And I always carry picks around in my pocket, even if I'm going from, and it's a kind of not a nervous thing. I've always done it. Do you know what I mean? But it's I
It's
always
like one
had
of
to have.
those, like a fidget
It's kind of
spinner.
like a fidget thing. But I kept going back to this mod. It's oversized, it's like 40 mil. So to put that in perspective, from top to bottom, a 351 is 31 millimeters. So this one is closer to 40 in terms of its full length. But I kept coming back to it, and it fills like the whole bit of your hand in there,
Hmm.
and it's super stable, and I really enjoyed playing with it. And I thought I'm going to try and make this again, and so I made one out of acrylic, this bright yellow and black acrylic, and I was going to take it to the guitar show, but I wanted to finish it before I took it down, and I made so many things for the show. And then I thought, like, there's no point in me taking this, for we've only got the one. So the Tuscan is the new thing, but it's kind of getting into like an abstract thing. But
Cool.
that is personally where I want to take it.
Cool.
So the um the Corinthian model is based off it's actually based off a window that I saw on Instagram in a brutalist structure in Spain. And I saw it and I was like, that whatever's going on with that, I want to try and do that.
Cool.
And so that was my interpretation of that window.
So you're
Yeah.
you're transcending use into art.
I,
You're merging the two.
well, I think
It's
it's
not just a pick. It's not just for function,
yeah,
but there's an aesthetic that you're holding to, and I
yeah.
can really
I,
appreciate that.
I think I think it's one of those things where for me it's always like, if I may be serious for a moment, um the the nature of a lot of my interests over the years has always been not because I'm, some divine anything, but like I really struggle to find people who have interests in the same things that I'm interested in to the degree in which I'm interested in them. And so I I get very hooked on these things, and I want for me the pick is an event to go into playing the instrument. I get much more invested in the guitars I have because I'm looking forward to using that particular pick or that particular material to play those things. So I know my Odessas inside and out. They were all kind of not custom jobs, because Mike just makes, much like me, he makes the bodies he makes, and then it's kind of up to you, really, in terms of neck dimensions and that. But having that relationship, um, and being surrounded by people like John from Lateral and Michael at Energy Effects and that sort of thing, and saying, you're doing your own thing, and I want to be part of that. Can we look at it from this angle rather than saying, I want you to make me something? Because I wouldn't be interested in what they were doing unless I was already interested in it.
Hmm.
So I I really love the fact that when I make these things and I'm sitting at my desk, because it's all files and sandpaper. You know, I cut my raw square on a bandsaw, which you can see just behind me actually, and then my
Yep.
belt sander is here, and I use that to rough out the blank, and then after that it's just all hands. Um, and I cut when you see my ridges following all the way down, I've done that by hand. I take an enormous amount of pride in doing that. Every time I make a pick, I'm like, man, I can't wait to use this, because it's just so exciting. And so to me, it's like it should be something you look forward to. You can just go and get black plastic and get on with your life,
Hmm.
right? But
Hmm.
like, so what? Make
There's no
it make
connection.
it
There's no connection there. Yeah.
but make it something that you're excited about using.
Hmm.
Otherwise, what is the point? Like, you don't feel as invested in the music you make. You don't feel as
Hmm.
invested in on a really deep personal level with what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. And it
And
makes total
you know,
sense. You know, a lot of players put so much passion into the guitar, into the
mm,
strings, into the plectrum is the next inevitable, uh,
yeah.
mostly sometimes overlooked aspect of the
Oh,
connection
it's
of the music, and the music improves. If
yeah,
everything is right, then the music will glow that much better.
yeah. Because
Yeah.
at its absolute fundamental bedrock level, the music is the music that we make as musicians, the art that we make as people, is the thing that stays around. It's the thing that you're making happen by your own volition. The music that you make, whether you're doing covers or ambient or grind or whatever, only exists because you're making it.
Mhm.
So why not, like, don't be ashamed of what you're doing. Like, don't apologize for what you're doing.
Mhm.
Invest in it and say, I want to do this. I want to
Mhm.
do it this way. I want to be
Mhm.
excited about it. And I want to listen back to my, even if it's a phone recording, I want to listen back
Mhm.
to that and say, oh man, I remember when I did that. Even
Mhm.
if nobody else ever hears it, like the millions of people worldwide who make music just for themselves in their rooms, that have never, it's never going to have an audience outside of their friends, completely irrelevant,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you like do you like the sounds you're making?
Mhm.
If you do,
Mhm.
then it's correct.
Mhm.
Never shy away from that aspect of it. And for me, it's like I made the Davidson and I made the Corinthian and some of the other models. I put that little flat bit on so that I could always stand it up on the table and I could look at it and go, yeah, man, look at that. Do you know what I
That's
mean?
it. That's it. And every
It
photograph you have of the Davidson, it's in that position. It's
Yeah,
sitting on the body of a guitar. It's sitting on the table.
yeah,
That's the Davidson. It's the look.
because I'm proud of it. And
Yeah.
I'm proud of the fact that, like, I get to make these and I said, as I said to people before, both in person and online, even if I never sold any of my own picks, which I have, fortunately, but if I never sold any of my own picks, I'd just make them anyway. Because to me, it's the most rewarding. I have so many things from so many people that I just think are the most amazing pieces of design. They're the most fabulous things to have a person wrapped up in. Whenever I play, like, actually, if I might, there was a particular catalytical moment in the whole development of heavy repping and my personal development, um, in relation to all of this, which was that there was a lad called Malta Sadler from Zoofoy, who I've mentioned briefly earlier on, and I got in touch with. There's a lad reached out to me called Scott Connor. Big shout outs to Scott, because without him, I wouldn't have made as many of the discoveries as I have. And he's a great bloke, and he really, really supported me through, like, from day one when I started doing this. And he hit me up uh, when heavy repping was still like a WordPress site, and said, um, and he said, look, me and a mate of mine, we made this list, right? So every time we came across a pick maker, we would add the name to the list, and it's just a great big Word document with all these names in. And so he sent it to me, and I thought, right, I'm just going to work my way through this list. And so I went down. It wasn't an alphabetical order or anything; it was just a list, and some of it's in like different typeface and this sort of stuff. So I go down it and I go down it, and I just thought, right, A is the person, is the maker still above ground, right? Is the maker
Right.
is the maker still making? Is the site dead? All this sort of stuff. So I just worked my way through it. And one of the people that I came across was Zoofoy, and I had a look at Malta's stuff, and he only did a handful of models, right? So he only did, I think it was 7 in total. The Rost, the Pick, the Nab, the Dob, and the Go. And he had a couple of prototype models. And I just thought I loved his approach to this. It was so out there. Um, Everything just looked like it had been designed by someone who wasn't a guitar player. I just thought it was fab. And so I hit him up. He had probably the worst website ever made. It was literally like white background with text and a couple of images on it. And I contacted him and I said, look, I want to review picks. I've got this website. If you want to send me anything for review, brilliant. I'll do a write up. I'll do photographs. I'll do this. If you don't, this is entirely up to you. I will buy your picks anyway. And I sent that out to a lot of people. Some people got in touch. Some people didn't. Some people were like, I don't need to do this. Fair enough. I'm not expecting anything from anybody, and I still don't. Malta decided he would send me one of everything he made.
Wow.
Which was, I bought some picks anyway, but he sent me a bunch of goes. He sent me the pick nab and dob, which were made of vulcanized rubber for some reason. And he sent me a couple of other things. And then we had this great, he's a German guy, we had this huge long correspondence. And I made sure to save all those emails because unfortunately he was very ill. He was quite a young lad. I think he was in his 30s. And I was talking to him up until days before he passed away in hospital. And one of my great regrets is that I never got to interview him. And I think the interview questions was one of the last things I sent him before he passed away. And his Go model, which is like an offset, it's kind of like an offset Jazz 3 sort of like inspired by the French Duras sort of thing. Although I'm almost certain he didn't know what those were. It was the first time I played a pick that made me feel like myself as a person and a player. And he sent me a bunch of when he was still well enough, he sent me a bunch of prototypes that he hadn't finished in a new material that he'd made called Maltex. And fuck knows what it is, man, but it's this white material and it's like a mil thick and it feels like it's made out of concrete. The power of it's like something from another dimension. And he made a couple of picks out of Peak, which is polyether ether ketone, which is favored a lot by Honey, Windspear, and people like that. Great material. This kind of beigey looking stuff, but he sent me a couple that he'd handmade that were like hand drilled at the kitchen table, that sort of stuff. Wow. And I always, whenever I do the I Rest My Case episodes and I share my picks with people, I always make sure they have to see them. It's so important. He was such a weird guy. And
I Rest My Case. What is that? Is that a video series, a podcast that you do?
I Rest My Case is a series where I take my briefcase of picks, which is basically a screw sorting toolbox, if I'm honest. But it's got a lot of stickers on it, so that's fine.
Okay.
And I take that to various people in and out of the industry, and they just go through it and choose stuff.
Nice.
And say, what is that, and I tell them about it and they play them.
Nice.
Because a lot of people will never get exposure to anything like that.
John, I'm thinking about it. Creating picks, it's a subtractive construction.
Mm-hmm.
You're sanding, you're grinding, you're cutting and hand polishing.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about 3D? Is there anyone out there producing 3D picks that are? I mean, 3D printing is a whole new world, right?
It is a whole new world. What's different? Not different, but what's
unfortunately, the materials are just much different in 3D printing as well, right?
There's a couple of people who do 3D printed picks, including Dave, who is in the Heavy Ripping Shop. Great lad, Dave. So shout out to him if he's watching. But the difficulty with it is that the sort of driving force behind a lot of 3D printing is that it's filament based. Right. Now, if you have, what do I do with it?
So, by nature, filament will have hollow parts within the construction.
Well, the issue is more that it's a bit like the carbon fiber problem, right? So, carbon fiber, if you're in a car and you go in like this, right, and it's an impact issue, and you're going onto the surface of carbon fiber, super. The problem with carbon fiber is it's got a grain. right? So as soon as you break the grain, which you have to
Mm,
do if you're going to bevel
mm-hmm,
it, as soon
mm-hmm.
as you break the grain, you're into the material, right?
Okay.
So as you play it, it starts to shed, you get dust everywhere.
Mm-hmm,
It makes a really weird scraping feeling and all this sort of stuff.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
The problem with filament printing is that it is the same. So because you have these like essentially piping making up the object, you can do some unbelievable. The guys at Filatone, who I bought this off at the guitar show, ah, look at that.
That's awesome.
It's a
Oh,
half
that's
fret.
nice.
It's a half fretless short scale baritone with a 3D printed fingerboard. Absolutely wonderful.
Bolt on
But
neck. Uh,
yeah, it's wild, man. But they were doing 3D printed picks, right? The problem with them at this stage is that in order you can mass produce them, no bother. If you're not heavy handed, they will last for a period of time. If you are heavy handed, away immediately because it's too fibrous, right? So
mm,
the only guys that can do, I mean, Dave's done some amazing stuff with 3D printing resin, which is a little bit more costly, and you need to know what you're doing with it. But he sent me a couple of his models, which he's up in Edinburgh in Scotland. He sent me a couple of models with 3D printed with resin that he didn't tell me what the material was, and I was trying to figure it out because resin's got a very dark, muted attack to it.
mm,
If you play with stuff like Surfite and Overpour,
mm,
it's got this kind of the chirp, which is the you get on the strings. That's quite it's quite evident in resin,
mm,
and this stuff was less so, and it was brighter and it was kind of more aggressive. And I was trying to think, this isn't acrylic? It doesn't feel like acrylic, but it kind of behaves like acrylic. And so he
mm.
said to me, "This is the 3D printed resin stuff, right?"
Wow.
Um, but it's the the issue is that you have to. It's still in the early stages in terms of production, so you have to have a 3D printer. You have to have a resin based 3D printer. You have to know what you're doing with CAD and all that sort of thing to do that. So
Right, right.
in time to come,
Mm-hmm,
um, people will be making crazy stuff with that, like really insane stuff, and I'm
mm-hmm,
very excited about that.
mm-hmm,
At this stage, it's not really ready. The materials that you need to do it with are not really ready for a very high abrasive environment because they're not they're impact resistant materials, but they're not abrasion resistant materials.
and the
So you,
profit margin after purchasing all that material just to make guitar picks, it's insane.
I mean, the most valuable resource we have as a species is time. Um, and it takes me from top down from a blank sheet of this stuff, which is so that's the blank I cut this pick from, right? So I get a section that's so it's just the thickness it came in, which is 6 mil. I get that from going from that piece there to this finished item probably takes me about an hour.
Oh wow.
It depends on the material. If you're doing like cellulose acetate, you can bang them out in about 30 minutes because it's much thinner and it's softer and blah, blah.
John,
But
someone needs to curate. I keep imagining when I lived in Atlanta a few years back, I went to a museum. It was a fine art museum,
yeah,
and they had an exhibition of sneakers.
mm,
But the development of sneakers over time to where they are now, the really
mm.
odd styles that have happened in the decades, and it was fascinating because I just had to go just to see the because my mind couldn't wrap around the importance of it.
Oh
And
yeah.
once you're there, yeah. And so I think someone needs to curate a fine art gallery showing of picks.
Well,
Each pick gets a frame, you know.
funnily enough, myself and Phil at Squished Picks, who's based in England here, he also does resin work. He's just joined Heavy Ripping recently. Phil's a really, really nice lad, and he and I and the group, the guild, talked about um, about doing this sort of thing. The good thing is that you don't need a big gallery, but the downside is you the downside is you also don't need a big gallery, and finding a small enough gallery for it's quite challenging. But yeah, there's so much the future of it. I mean, if we think about it in these terms, the pick scene as it is now has
Yeah.
only been how it is now for about the last 5 years.
Wow.
Because there's been guys going back along, Patrick Huffschmidt, Vinny from VPix, Echo from Chicken Picks. I suppose technically Corey from Dragon's Heart goes back along a fair bit, but like the way we are now with everyone that's in the scene, with Arcanum and Rombo and Bog Street and like Master 8 and like Hawk and all that sort of stuff, that's only really been focused in that sort of window, right? As you know yourself, guitarists are hell for trying to talk around into anything new that isn't something they don't understand, because nobody wants to admit they don't know anything. Fair enough. But what will be produced in time to come will be incredibly exciting. And to look back at the lineage that we've got going back to the tail end of the 19th century and what we were making there. I mean, there's some, if you go and have a look at Will Hoover's book, which is now getting really expensive because there weren't that many made. We were doing some wild shit back in the day. Like the period between 1900 and about 1940 was the Wild West of picks, because of guys like Nick Lucas and people like that who popularized the 351. But all of a sudden, people were like, "We're going to just throw it." All the Italians were doing crazy stuff. The French went absolutely mad. They were making all sorts of crazy things. Herder in Germany were making crazy stuff. The Japanese and Koreans got in on it in the 60s and 70s. Their celluloid is like nothing on earth. So we have actually, although the pick predates the electric guitar by some 50 years or more, even if we're just talking about the electric guitar. So it's got a very long lineage already. Where we take it, where the scene takes it in time to come, I couldn't say. But all of the indications are that it's going to be, people will adopt more materials, more shapes, they'll have less fear, they'll be in the hands of more people. People will start getting over this thought thing about the price threshold, because you got no problem going out there and saying, I'm going to chuck 150 quid, 200 quid at an overdrive, which is a very hotly contested marketplace. Or you're gonna blast like 300 quid in a reverb, but you're gonna bulk at spending $15 on a pick. Come on.
Right.
Well,
Maybe the next inevitable step might be just a really nice coffee table book.
Well, I have. There's a book called The Illustrated Encyclopedia of the Electric Guitar, which was a huge thing for me.
Yeah.
Loved that book. It introduced me to so many makers I didn't know about, and like Valeno and like Bond and all this sort of stuff. And I always loved the out there thinking of just saying, I just want to make this. Let's just make it. Nice. Great, and so in time to come, I would love to do that because obviously I do my own photography and everything. I would love to do that with picks, because it's such a big story to tell.
Absolutely.
And I've actually got the stuff in my hands to make it work.
There you go.
Doing that over and above life is very challenging.
Of course.
So
I could see you overcoming that obstacle for sure.
Well, maybe I'll get a chance, but we shall see.
Well, John, I really do look forward to the next designs, because it's definitely seeing where you've come from and where you're at now on the Davidson. They're works of art in themselves, and
Thanks,
the design progress is noticeable. It's a from the tadpole in the ocean to man walking upright. You can see the transition to where it's at. I look forward to seeing what's next for sure.
That's very great, mate. Really,
John, I really do appreciate your time.
Of course, man.
You're a super busy dude, but I end every episode with the 3-part question. A
Yes.
three-part answer to one question.
Yes.
If you were on a desert island and you had
Yes.
three guitar tracks to put on your mixtape, what would those guitar tracks, and you're allowed to say musicians if you want, you're allowed to say albums. What three tracks would you put on that mixtape?
I know
And
when you
man,
talk.
considering how stylistically diverse your tastes are, I can't wait for your response.
I mean, honestly, you told me about this when we were talking on Instagram, and I've been thinking about it since because it's one of those things like how do you pick a favorite finger? Um,
Oh man.
I mean, the ones that were I'm gonna have to say albums because it's or actually
Sure.
just artists because it's too hard otherwise.
Sure.
So the ones that really like the artists that really made me go wow wow and led me down paths where the first record by Enablers called End Note, which is a masterpiece of a record. It's two guitars, drums, and a guy doing poetry over the top of it.
Oh wow.
Um, and they like I like the beat stuff and all that, like Kerouac and everything, but I'd never I didn't get into Enablers through Kerouac. I got into Kerouac through Enablers because they were on the. I was a huge Neurosis fan back in the day, and around the Sun That Never Sets period, and they had a track called Polly's Days in Cinema on the New Rot Recordings sample compilation disc, and I just never heard anybody do anything like that.
Wow.
And the fact that the fact that there was no bassist, the fact that the album was recorded all in one go live, and you can hear bits where the drummer's like running over slightly, or you
Mm-hmm.
know, just I can't even I cannot tell you how many times I've listened to that record.
The enablers.
Enablers End Note is
And no.
the yeah, it's got the do you know it's got the there's a track on it called Manly, which has the most wonderful because it's all spoken word stuff. It's got the most marvelous opening stanza ever in the in just that the way it's got this riff that's and it's like it's being the guitar's slightly distorted, but the mic's like a little bit too far away, and there's no drums or anything. And Matey comes in, and he's got this really old American voice, like proper deep thing. And he says, I hit ground bobbing critically and floored against the shocks on dirt clay, the last of the humpbacks vanishing in the rear view as I lift again, fast among the windsprung trees, the air cool about my chest. I had the old McClellan Sloans once, but I stopped dealing in shy measures, lit up the county courthouse, and I aimed to keep firing, become my own favourite infidel, apprised of a stellar wash, so clear and distinct I'd swear it was a jangling glory of bells. And it's the whole record's like that, and it's just fucking brilliant.
How old were you when you discovered that album?
Oh man, that was 2000, so I would have been 20.
Oh man. Wow.
And it was just like it's all the band. It brings in bands like Wire and Rites of Spring and Unwound and all the weird end of that real hard guitar sound, but without it being mega saturated. It's not a heavy album.
Okay.
So that
Nice.
God, because it's only three. Do you know what I mean? I mean, as
Well, when you were a kid, what, and what I always do,
oh man,
what
yeah.
I would do is I'd go back to what made you pick up a guitar? Who
Manic
was it that was like,
It
yeah?
was Manic Street Preachers' Gold Against the Soul, which I had on cassette, and the Holy Bible was more important in that regard, like their album, The Holy Bible. But Gold Against the Soul was the one I really, really liked because it was poppy, but it had this real the real teeth. And James Dean Bradfield's still one of my all-time favorites. There's very few guitar players that I like look up to, but I guess because he was singing and playing, and he just did these great guitar sound, and he's a really good player, and he had really great delivery, and he always sounded like he was giving it 110%. So Gold Against the Soul, really the first, especially just because we used to listen to them on tape back in the day, like the first side of that is basically just one, in my experience of it, was basically just one track.
Cool.
And then the second half starts with Roses in the Hospital and ends with like Symphony of Tourette's, which was the heaviest track they ever did.
Wow. That sounds like a proper number 2 choice then, in my opinion.
The third one is there's lots of people I would put into this, and I really want to say my number 1 album of all time is Venom by Breach, but I wouldn't. That's not a desert island because it's too angry. It's not. It's not a. It's an unbelievable record. If you're into anything heavier style, it feels like the record just willed itself into existence. Like there's no band involved. It's an amazing album.
What a great description.
But if you listen to it, you'll hear what I mean. It's incredible. It's not even their best. Their best record is Collapse because it's their last one, and it was super far-reaching, that album. But Venom is like a living organism. It's incredible.
I was a little frightened because I thought you just chose a Venom album. And
no,
when I first heard Venom, I scared the shit out of me. I was like, "What the fuck is this?"
You know, the funny thing is, I came to them after getting into bands like Emperor and Mayhem, and then when I heard Venom, I was like, "Oh, it's really boring." But then they wouldn't be; those bands wouldn't be Dark Throne and the whole like second wave Norwegian scene wouldn't be a thing without them. So it's
I was in a record store and cassettes, and I'm like, "Oh, dude, this cover is awesome. I have to get this." And then right next to it was Celtic Frost. And I fucking regret that purchase too. Yeah. I was like, you know what? I gave him right away. I gave him to my best friend. I'm like, you like this shit? Here. I was a huge metalhead, but I feel like a really tame metalhead because I was Tony Iommi. I was Iron Maiden. I was the progression of Judas Priest from Rock-a-Rolla to, Defenders of the Faith. I thought I was a metal guy. And then I listened to that and I went, Jesus Christ, I'm listening to wussy music. This is tame. It's a different world.
Vibe, man.
Different world.
But all those bands, your Priests and Maidens and Saxons and that, they're the guys that fostered that existence.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
But yeah, it's a really hard push, this.
Okay.
But if I number three as an artist, I mean, there's two guys basically. There's Lamont Young, and Bill Orcutt, and Bill Orcutt is a mercurial guitar player in the true sense. He was in a band called Harry Pussy back in the day, and then he was also in a band called Watt, W-A-T-T, whose EP was released on Bandcamp a while ago, and it's instrumental. It's just guitar and drums. And he plays in a really weird tuning. And he did a record called A New Way to Pay Old Debts. And it was when I first got Spotify. And I remember I was living in this dilapidated attic in London. And nothing cool about it. It was incredibly dangerous and not good. But I just got Spotify and I was starting to dig into it. It had loads of avant-garde stuff on, and these were things that were hard to get hold of, right? So I found this record called A New Way to Pay Old Debts, and it sounds like, I'm trying to think of it, like when I first heard it, I was like, what is going on? It's just this guy with an acoustic, and he was just playing he's not singing, he's just playing the guitar, but in a way that I'd never heard anybody do it. And it was so monumental that I just didn't. I completely didn't get it at first, and then the more I listened to it, there's something. Breach was the same. There was something there that I had never experienced, and I kept listening to it. And then he brought out a couple of other records, Colonial Donuts, and he brought out Odds Against Tomorrow, and did a couple of records with Chris Corsano, who's also amazing. He did The Young Cricketer, which is a brilliant record. He's a drummer. He used to play for Bjork and stuff. But they did a couple of records together, Brace Up and Made Out of Sound, which are wild sauce. But I remember listening to Bill Orcutt and thinking, like, this guy, as I get from a guitar player's point of view, this is the closest that I've ever got to what I would like. It's complete. He's a pure player, right? He's not an Eric Johnson. He's not measured. He's not careful. None of that. He's untamed, and it's so free and beautiful. Wow. And when he did Odds Against Tomorrow in his self-titled record, those are his most mature, sedate sort of records. And I got to see him in London last year.
Oh wow!
And he just looked like a guy out of the crowd. He was playing a telly with 4 strings, tuned G, 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 E, A, so no A and no D string. I plugged straight into a DeVille, Tweed DeVille, no drive, with a little bit of reverb on, and that was it. And he sounded exactly like he did on the records, and I genuinely couldn't believe it. Because if you go and listen to literally anything he's done, and you think this is improv, this is Derek Bailey, this is Atomi Yoshihide, this is Fred Frith, like this is way out. No, it's written like that, and I just couldn't get my head around it. It was like I'm a huge Sun Ra fan, and it was like hearing Sun Ra for the first time and going, how and what, and how did you get here from this?
Wow!
You know?
Wow! High praise.
But I mean, I choose Ra, but that's.
You had a Sun Ra T-shirt on that video that I watched where you're talking about that. Yeah, I was actually I was blown away by that. I'm like, you don't see that very often, and he is highly overlooked.
No,
sure.
one of the best to ever do it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Orcutt was he's one of, as a mark of this, he's one of the few people. I like a lot of extreme stuff. I like a lot of weird stuff. Fine. To me, it's just adventure. But he's one of the few people that when I show him to other musicians, they have exactly the same experience. They go, "What the hell is happening? Ah, I get it." And then they hear the beauty in it. It's incredible. So yeah,
man, thank you, John. My catalog has expanded 3 more for sure. For sure. John, thank you so much for your time, man. You're a busy dude for sure. I look forward to seeing what art you can create next. And I'm definitely going to jump on your site and purchase a grab bag of some of your picks and seeing if I can find my new jazz go-to. Thank you, sir,
a pleasure, man.
for all your beauty and all your work.
Thank you very much.